Well, hello to everyone. Welcome. My name is Zrinka Stahulyak. I'm professor in comparative literature and European languages and transcultural studies here at UCLA. And it is my pleasure to see so many of you here for today's lecture of the UCLA program in experimental critical theory, founded in 2008 by Ken Reinhardt. ECT, Experimental Critical Theory, is housed in the Department of Comparative Literature and generously supported by the Deans of Humanities and Social Sciences and donors. I'm very happy to co-direct the ECT with Julia Sisa, professor in political science and classics. We have dedicated this year's seminar to comparative thinking, placing comparison at the heart of what is experimental about critical theory. Comparison can be understood as a predictable quest for analogies and similarities to be discovered between phenomena that we consider at the outset as comparable on account of cultural diffusion, historical tradition, or geographical contiguity. But this is not what we intend to do in this seminar. We take the disposition to think in comparison and by comparison as a fundamental way of looking at the world through provocative contrasts, experimental connections, and unexpected fluidities. From comparative history and anthropology to world literature and global history, how does comparison disrupt and transform modes of linear and teleological thinking? From synchronic, transnational, spatial, and network paradigms of the world, is comparison viable transperiodically, but not chronologically? That is, what is comparison in asynchronous, asymmetrical, and heterotopic situations? What are its conditions of possibility? And crucially today, the new questions that comparison opens up and the effects it produces in the world. Throughout the winter and spring quarters, talks by our seminar guests will take place every Monday on Zoom from 12 to 1 PST. And I will put later more information in the chat. But today, we are very pleased to welcome Etienne Anheim, who is currently Directeur d'études, full professor at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. His work focuses on cultural forms and material wealth in Europe in late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, especially manuscripts, archives, music, and pictorial works, and more generally on heritage sciences. He has published Clément VI au travail, Clement VI at work, reading, writing, and preaching in the 14th century, and Le Travail de l'Histoire, the work of history in 2018. He has also pursued research in the fields of historiography, epistemology of the social and historical sciences, and theory of interdisciplinarity. He was from 2011 to 2018 editor-in-chief of the worldwide known journal Annales, Histoire Sciences Sociales. And now he's head of the editions of l'EHESS, École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. He's also a member of the Scientific Council of the Louvre Museum. Today, he will present for us Where Does Nature End and Culture Begin? Cultural Heritage Between Anthropology and Epistemology. We are very happy to have him join us here from Paris, where it's very late. Thank you, Etienne, for being here with us.
Thank you very much, Zrinka. I'm very happy to be here too. Not really here, but as Claude Calam said, we are in Paris, but happy to be with you. And I wish to thank you and to thank Julia for this invitation. And I have to apologize for my bad English. And this is the very first time that I present a paper in a Zoom seminar in English. So I really hope you will not be too disappointed. And I would like to begin this talk with a question, a simple question. Is DNA a natural or cultural heritage? This question, which seems so simple, is further complicated when one considers a fossil DNA preserved, for example, in a block of amber kept in a paleoarchaeological collection. And if this fossil DNA can, in addition, give rise to the recreation of a disappeared animal species whose public exposure may generate a profitable tourist activity. It may be considered that it is the perfect meeting point between natural heritage, cultural heritage, and development in its socio-economic value. Of course, the disaster is never to exclude, such as in the case of the dinosaurs of Jurassic Park, which remind us to which point the issue of the return effect on society and on the environment, the feedback, takes a fundamental place in the economic and scientific issues related to the defense and the preservation of heritage, whether that heritage is cultural or natural. These two types of heritage seem apparently to raise two modes of different knowledge, one of the order of human and social sciences and the other of experimental sciences, or to use the language of scholarly debate in Germany in the late 19th century, natural sciences, Naturwissenschaften, and cultural sciences, Kulturwissenschaften. Does the meeting of these two scientific approaches related to heritage take note of the circumstance or even of the fashion which is making interdisciplinarity one of the criteria for awarding funding to research today? Or can it, on this basis, go beyond this fashion effect and really take seriously the comparison between disciplines and comparison between objects? It is this opinion that I would like to defend in this presentation in arguing in favor of the adoption by researchers of the logic of judo, which is to use the strength of the opponent to unbalance him. And in other words, in this case, to use the force of social, economic, and political expectations toward the category of heritage and in its interdisciplinary treatment to return it. Faced with preconceived ideas which assume that heritage has a defining value which seems to be a safe haven in the contemporary world, and that human sciences will bring to its study an extra bit of soul to complement the contributions of serious science, it seems to me indeed that it is possible to defend another approach from a review of the concepts that we have raised, the nature-culture coupling. The heritage division between nature and culture is one of the largest divisions commonly used in the social sciences, humanities, but also in the study of heritage and its legislation. Its apparent obviousness rests on the use of a conceptual coupling, which is located at the very heart of Western culture. And however, when we try to understand the delineation of the boundary of the frontier between the two concepts in the field of heritage, everything becomes more complicated. The distinction between the two concepts is first a historical production of the Western tradition. The perception of culture as heritage is a phenomenon that goes back to the Enlightenment. The end of the 18th century saw the consecration of the museum and its collection as a privileged place for this movement. The idea of natural heritage forged by imitation has its origin a little later in the philosophy of nature that flourishes with romantic thought. And it is found in the United States with Thoreau, for example, a suitable ground of expression. It is the growth of the concept of wilderness, for example, that should be defended and which concern primarily landscapes. This is the era of the institutionalization of the first natural parks, such as Yosemite, for example, while in France, there was the protection of the Fontainebleau forests and also its illustration by artistic currents like the Barbizon School. The museum and the park, the two parallel models which are based on the idea of protection of cultural or natural forms to which is lent a high spiritual value for the whole of humanity. This natural heritage, cultural heritage coupling found a new impetus in the 60s, 70s decades in the context of Western prosperity, but also of rapid change in industrialized societies. The concept of heritage was taking on an increasingly broad expansion, as we know, and the definition of cultural heritage in the 18th century builds on the tradition inherited from the classic Renaissance, in particular around the fine arts. But from the beginning of the 20th century, we have observed its extension also to non-European artifacts with universal aesthetic value, and hence the aesthetic was loaned. Witness, for example, the invention of African art by colonial European ethnology and museography. But in the post-war period, items from the daily life, including those closest to us, became the subject of cultural heritage with, for example, the development of the Ecomuseums, an expression recognized by the International Council of Museums in 1971, and also local ethnographic museums. In the natural field, if we compare from the center of gravity, which was landscape, the concept developed in connection with the development of biological sciences and the new sensitivity toward protection of the environment. The question arises as to the preservation of biological diversity, but also, for example, as also of genetics as heritage, and more generally of the heritage status of the living, including through the problem of the commodification of patents. And today, the terms of natural and cultural heritage are imposed to designate all collective artifacts and ecofacts which surround us and to which we attach particular value. But in the period which began in 1960, these concepts also entered into law, and from then on, we are able to rely on legislative frameworks. In the United States, you probably know that the Wilderness Act of 1964 gave a federal framework to the protection of natural territories, while in France, the 1962 Malraux Act on the preservation of cultural and in particular architectural heritage is framed by the National Parks Act in 1960 and the Act on Regional Parks in 1967. Once again, the development of the concepts present a sort of mirror fashion, which in France is reflected by the creation of the National Inventory of Natural Heritage on the model of the General Inventory of Cultural Heritage. However, the accuracy of legal frameworks with regard to the definition of the border is inadequate. From this point of view, the UNESCO recommendation on the protection of natural and cultural heritage adopted in 1972 deserves special attention. It takes care both to distinguish between the two concepts and to link them throughout the text. This preservation is regarded as a collective wealth, a metaphor borrowed from the field of economics and capitalism in a way that is quite significant, to which we shall return, and I quote the UNESCO recommendation, considering that the deterioration or disappearance of any item of the cultural or natural heritage constitutes a harmful impoverishment of the heritage of all the nations of the world. Heritage is defined as a set of material. However, the mention of nature in the cultural sites, like the mention of aesthetics within natural heritage, show that it is difficult, really difficult to fix the border. And the human point of view is omnipresent. It is he or she who makes heritage from nature. And on the other hand, the cultural artifacts have a natural dimension, at least in the sense that they have physical, chemical, biological characteristics for which the research can account. These convergences, as well as the fact that the concepts are historically and legally defined in relation to one another, incite a prolongation of the reflection on the distinction between nature and culture from another point of view, that of epistemology. If public policies are reciprocally inspired in the definition and protection of natural and cultural heritage, does it follow then that we should find what clearly distinguishes them in one or the other styles of knowledge? I go back to this question because that is what one could believe if one considers that the world of knowledge is divided between natural sciences and cultural sciences. And we would be faced with two styles of knowledge, one which affects the world, the other humankind, with on one side the explanatory sciences and on the other comprehending sciences. And that does indeed seem effective if you look at things from afar. On one side, for example, the Loire Valley, a natural heritage site where the investigation of experimental science is relevant. And on the other side, another French example, the castle of Chambord, which human sciences can make into an object of historical or artistic or aesthetic interpretation. But if we think, we know that if we look more closely, the reality of the scientific analysis is different, because it's very difficult, for example, and I saw my friend Meredith Cohen just before, it's really difficult to study the Renaissance architecture and the Renaissance castle of Chambord without taking into account the geological characteristics and physico-chemical of the tuffeau stone, which provides the crucial part of the stone and which poses specific problems of use and of degradations. And here the connection between natural heritage and cultural heritage is located at the very heart of the monument. And the same goes for the Loire, which has long been regarded as a very natural landscape, the last great French river in a wild state, until from the end of the 90s, the work of geographers and archaeologists highlighted the essential role of older facilities, in particular in medieval times, medieval times, because in the current profile of the river and its valley, we can see the medieval river and not the original one. The interpretation of the Loire ecosystem and its dynamics must therefore integrate historical and archaeological data. The human and social sciences are not there as an addition or an extra bit of soul. They play a key role for scientific analysis. And everything depends on the scale at which we position the research. At the one-on-one, you say that in English, one-on-one scale, a painting is a subject within the history of art. And at the micro scale, it is chemistry, organic and inorganic, and the physics of the materials. Conversely, the degree of anthropization of the spaces is such that the notion of natural heritage has become very relative. Once again, it is the degree of interpenetration between nature and culture and between scientific disciplines, which is striking when one broaches topics of heritage. Thus, the concrete results of this interdisciplinary approach exist on at least 3 levels. The basic one, where the disciplines play a role of assistance for positive data. The archaeologists who provide historical data on the Loire, the chemists on the pigments of pictorial work. But this very instrumental level is not the most interesting in my view, because then there are genuine interpretative collaborations in which the different disciplines develop research questions which are proper to them on the same study. This is, for example, the aim of a project on the early plans of Versailles in 3 dimensions. This project is associated with the restorers of the National Archives, who have been able, on this occasion, to protect a collection of great value, these old plans. But the curators, architects, and historians of Versailles, who have been able to take up the interpretation of the progressive development of the building of the castle, but also of IT professionals and mathematicians who have worked on this occasion on new models of restitution of the elevations from the 2-dimensional plans to the 3D. Finally, on a 3rd level, these collaborations can produce methodological and theoretical effects on scientific knowledge, which are reflected by the co-publications from human and experimental sciences researchers. For example, this has been the case between anthropologists, cognitivists, roboticists, and museographers regarding the experience of the so-called Berenson robot from Berenson, the art historian, Berenson robot at the Quai Branly Museum. It is a project which raises the question of the capacity of acquisition by an artificial intelligence of an aesthetic sense, or at least of an observational report on the heritage value of its environment, looking for people in the museum and learning from them. Another example, the work that I have conducted with physicists of the synchrotron Soleil in Saclay, near from Paris, on the study of heritage material and its methodology, by reflecting on the practical uses of the synchrotron light on cultural heritage artifacts, such as the analysis of pigments for painting of the 15th century, or that of the composition of the varnish of the 7th, 18th centuries instruments, such as Stradivarius violins, we realized that there was a level of interdisciplinarity which was deeper than the exchange of results. A portion of the methodologies, a portion of the methodologies that we used called upon a similar conceptual architecture based on a limited number of concepts, which relate to both the humanities and the experimental sciences, the natural and the cultural heritage. The isolation of a small number of these concepts was sought, and the clarification of the theoretical use, whereupon there were concrete consequences in each other methodology. The first results, I have to take maybe to show an example. The first results have concerned the notion of trace, vestige, path, sign. The question is of trace, which is fundamental for the historian, as was shown by Carlo Ginzburg in a famous article in 1980, but which is also a concept of reference in chemistry, physics, analysis, based on the discrimination of what is called trace elements. And this conceptual convergence is not only metaphorical. On the contrary, it makes a common theoretical structure appear, which we are continuing to study from other multilateral, if I can say, multilateral concepts, such as, for example, the corpus, data, scale. You can see we all use this concept of corpus, data, and scale. And these results have concrete instrumental implications, but they open the broad horizon of boundary epistemology, which makes it possible to understand how natural sciences and cultural sciences can connect in a logical sequence with each other. And this concern of connection met with recent research, and that's my anthropological point of view at the end. This concern of connection met with recent research in the field of anthropology, and in particular in the wake of works by Philippe Descola, professor at the Collège de France, who published in 2005 Par-delà nature et culture, Beyond Nature and Culture. And this book shows that the division between nature and culture is a specificity of the Western world, which has gradually developed from the end of the Middle Ages. And that's why, as a medievalist, I'm particularly interested in this question. Because as we know, for a lot of other social universes in time and space, the division is not at all obvious. The concept of nature separate from man is in reality minor in the world scale. And the idea that man falls within culture and not from a continuum with nature is equally rare. Descola's perspective returns us to the evidence of our own distinctions. We saw the legal difficulty in distinguishing natural heritage from cultural heritage. It has also been seen that at the epistemological level, convergence was strong. And ultimately, from an anthropological point of view, it is the consistency of these concepts that can be put in doubt. This doubt does not mean that we must abandon all our representations on the word and the organization of knowledge, but at least the scientific interests of the confrontation between natural heritage and cultural heritage goes well beyond the exchange of experiences. this confrontation guides us toward new questions for which it is not the territories that count, but rather the interface, the boundary, the frontier. The nature-culture coupling derives its importance of theoretical and practical problems that it allows to pose to the scientific community and then more broadly to society, which is concerned about its heritage, a concept that now we must return to close the paper. And I just want to add a few words about this question, because very often heritage does not pre-exist in research. It is one of its products. And we all very often forget that. Research has an effect of patrimonialization. And this patrimonialization process on the artifacts or ecofacts is very important because it recalls that the researcher is not separated from the world, which is consistent with the criticism of the boundary between nature and culture. Here again, it is the essential problem not only of science, but of public policies, that of the feedback. For researchers, heritage are the interface of nature culture, allows experimentation with approaches that lead to new positive results, to methodological enhancement, but also to the development of an innovative theoretical framework, which erases the dualism of human sciences, natural sciences. But the output is also to justify the place of our sciences in public policies, not by strengthening identity-related expectations or immediate economic gains related to heritage, but thereby reformulating the stakes for submitting them to collective and democratic reflection. And because our concern for heritage expresses our relationship to the world, we have never had so much technology and knowledge, and have never felt so helpless in this sense. And it is without doubt the fact of a new lucidity, thanks to which we are conscious of our limits, which are also those of the anticipation of our actions and their effects in return. But what heritage, cultural or natural, makes possible is to place this question at the center of our society. Through heritage, the problem for the research is not to control the word, the science, but to control the action of men and women and of science on the world. And heritage makes apparent the problem of feedback precisely by comparing nature and culture. And I will stop here because I think that I've been already a little bit long, and I thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. We're going to have a Q&A session of this talk. So please use the raise hand function only if you would like to ask the question. And while I let everyone reflect on this, on Etienne Anheim's talk, let me just, Etienne, while other guests are thinking about it, I wanted to just say something that in immediate reaction is what one of the things that seems to me you were highlighting is another way of saying what you have said, is that nature also demands time or demands temporality. That is, while thinking of cultural heritage through time in let's say historical terms, because you are a historian, is something that might seem more natural when it comes to the collecting, when it comes to artifacts. it's certainly what was very striking is to say nature is less obvious, a temporal kind of, the ecofact is easier to present as a static kind of immobile, right, product that is there, which is a park. It's the way it is. And I just was very curious about how you introduce time into these questions, and how through different levels that you presented to us, time works in these three ways that you pointed out to us: the assistance for positive data, the research questions that would be proper to each discipline, and then the effects on scientific knowledge, and then how temporality works with what you, I think, you really highlighted, which is the opposition between science and possibly what we might refer to as public discourse, or as what you pointed out, sort of the economic aspects of the heritage question. So I don't know if you want to maybe address this question of time and how you see it work through, or if you wanted to add anything to this, the take that on the talk that you presented.
Yes, maybe I can try to address your question. I'm happy that you understand anything at my this presentation, and I think that this question is very important because time and temporality are the key concepts in this case, because we have to rediscover the question of what was called once natural history, because this is not a discovery, but I think that we really have to keep in mind that this division of the 18th century may be a part of 19th century reflection between the natural history and the social and the human history is very important, because a large part of the natural phenomena were put a part of the general history, because that was apparently not a social history, and that could not enter in the new framework of the social sciences and humanities. But we know that until this point, the question of natural history was very important, for example, in geology, in zoology, and that all these fields contributed to coin a new concept of temporality during the 18th and the 19th centuries. And today we can clearly see, when one works with physicists, that they have their own and very interesting concept of time and temporality. Because with our colleague in archaeology, for example, or in environmental sciences, it's very clear that you have to count with this data that are given by the natural processes of transformation. The most interesting word in this case is, I don't know if we can use it in English, altération in French, because there is you can hear the Latin word alter. It means that something is always changing. And for example, everybody knows that the pigments in a painting, the pigments are always transforming themselves, and it's a huge problem of interpretation, not only for the art historian because of the colors, but also for restorers and for a lot of things. So it's a sort of social natural history of pigments. And for example, here, and that was my point, you can think to this collab, but maybe I could have imagine talking about Tim Ingold or Bruno Latour, and all this human, non-human interface is very relevant for this sort of analysis. So I really think you're right, and that's the occasion to reorganize our concept of time and temporality, re-including this sort of natural, these eco-facts that are very relevant to build a general history, I think.
Thank you for that. That really. I'm grateful for you to have answered the question so pointedly. Greg Wolf has a question.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much for the talk, which I found very interesting. I was a little unsure what you propose for the future, because some of your rhetoric was about a collaboration between natural and cultural science, social sciences. But other parts of it suggested that the boundaries should be broken down. And thinking of it as somebody with archaeological interests, breaking it down seems much more productive to me. And I'm thinking about a few hard problems that arise if we preserve if we continue to think of ecofacts and artifacts as different, then we run into some real difficulties. One of them, for example, is how we handle human skeletal remains, which are commonly treated as if they're artifacts, but of course are eco-facts in some senses. And in terms of as long as we have two separate moral universes, one for nature and one for culture, we're going to run into problems there. How do we, do we apply, for example, different moral standards to treating domesticated animals, which are in a sense artifacts, from wild animals? And when we think about the wild, is there a risk that we no longer recognize that the kind of wilderness we talk about is itself culturally constructed? You think about la pensée sauvage, and la pensée sauvage is a cultural artifact, and a very recent one, and one which perhaps won't last forever. So I would be in favor of trying to break down the boundary as much as we can. And when we come to questions of agency, although practically we only control some of the agency in the equation, to treat human agency and natural agency as quite separable seems to lead to less good explanations than if we think of them all working together. So I'm completely convinced by what you say about the distinction being an artificial and local one. And I wonder also whether it's really just a secularization of an older distinction between the world described in the book of nature and the world described in the book of the Bible, and whether what we've done instead is we've allowed the book of the Bible to become a sort of blueprint for a secularized cultural worldview, and then we still treat the book of nature as if it describes something different. So, my feeling is that although I can see the value of the UNESCO Declaration, continuing to treat cultural and social goods as being different seems to me to lead to further problems down the road.
I completely agree with you, and I'm completely convinced by what you said and proposed, because my point was to underline, as you said, the artificial and local history of nature and culture, and to ask the question of the consequences of this critique on our epistemological frameworks. And that's I think the real question, because that's one thing to recognize after this collage that nature and culture are a sort of Western construction, but that's another problem to understand what we could build in our fields with this sort of criticism. And I think you're right. The question is not only the collaboration and not the opposition between artifacts and ecofacts, but to build a new conception of science, I think. The problem, and that was why I continue to use these old concepts, the problem is that we have to deal with a social history of knowledge, and we have to recognize that the disciplines are still organizing the knowledge, and that's I had to to explain this point in my paper. You're right. I think that we are just in a moment in which we can reshape the dualism of the Western epistemology in a sort of monism, a sort of new interpretation of the continuum of the sciences. And so I hope we can go to as far as you said, but I think it's a long way.
Julia Sisa.
Thank you very much, Etienne. This was wonderful, and this is going to resonate and stay with us for a long time, as we hope you too, because we are going to focus on this question of new ways of thinking about nature and culture in our ECT project. So this is a wonderful opening, and I would have two questions. One is about what you said toward the end of your paper about heritage as a product of research, as and the outcome of a
patrimonialization. I saw the word once or twice in English, but I don't know if you really use it.
To be honest, I don't know either, and I was trying to echo you, but I like the idea of this notion of a thinking that produces its own object. And I would like to ask you the following. You know, time, of course, temporality, all the way I've understood, I get it. But what do you think about the way this time is lived in order to produce heritage? You know, it seems to me that perhaps the notion of care should be injected here, a sort of Heideggerian time here, because you can have the most wonderful forest and, you know, just neglect them, precisely not take care of them. And there you are, you don't have Fontainebleau. And in the same way, you must have the most wonderful castles and ruins and let them go. And then you don't have Chambord as it is. So I think that this resonates with what Zrinka was saying about policy. Is there really a sort of moral or political engagement there? And here is a bit what I think I heard in Greg's intervention, that is absolutely essential in the very constitution of this experience of time, let's say, that can generate heritage. And the more we are aware of the caring aspect of this experience, the more we are aware of the breaking down or of the radical difference of the two kind of ways of being in the world. The other question is about this now, you know, pervasive discourse of beyond nature and culture, so the Scholar and Vivero de Castro, we are all in a sense reading this text and trying to take up the challenge. Jeffrey Lloyd, among classicists, for instance, is very active in this kind of thinking. And I have a question for you, since you are so close to, to the intellectual milieu in which this happens. I mean, how far you go in taking this really seriously and literally? I'm not here to, in a sense, to be the devil's advocate for Lévi-Strauss, but it seems to me that perhaps the sort of reference point of the Scholar in his so-called beyond or reversal being Lévi-Strauss, that perhaps we could, you know, go back just a moment and question if precisely in that kind of anthropological ontology, the point was it really a separation between nature and culture? You know, that distinction was set into motion in narratives called myth, and it was all about transformations, about reversals, about inversions, about parallelism that would precisely handle the distinction, the sort of premise of the distinction, and create all sort of noise and alteration, as you say. And this is why in this kind of mythological thought, metamorphosis is so important. Actually, it's fundamentally metamorphic thinking, metamorphic way of thinking in which distinctions are set up only to be constantly fluidified, and in such a way that precisely the boundaries, as you said, we have to be much more attentive to frontiers and boundaries. But that was the point of structural analysis. It was to precisely show how the distinctions are constantly transgressed, are constantly, once again, set in narrative motion. So I would have many other questions about precisely the periodization of all this, but I stop because ancient, you know, Greek antiquity and Roman antiquity, we have a lot to say about the complications of these ontologies, but these are my two questions. Thank you, Etienne.
No, thank you very much, and I really hope that I really will try to answer these very interesting questions. So I go back to the beginning of your question on the topic of heritage as a product of research, because the fact that I would like to underscore on this point is that very often researchers that deal with heritage think that they have a sort of neutral position, and that what they are doing with these eco artifacts doesn't affect the status of these things. Whereas I really think that if we have to imagine what could be a feedback in the field of humanities, the heritage is really the good topic, because it summarizes the canonization question, I think that what we have to keep in mind is that heritage is not a status but a process, and if heritage is a process, this is a social and political and economic history of this process, and we, the academics, are a part of this process, and everything we are doing, everything that we are writing on the past matter in this case. And that goes back to the question of time and care, because I think that's what we are doing here. If I study a painter of the 14th century, I care, and this was very interesting in your question, because it makes me think that even in this naturalist approach of time, we do not have to imagine a linear and continuous time. And the interesting point in the question of the care is to build a non-linear process, a discontinuous process, because there are periods in which we care about certain things and other no. And this is a very long story. I work a lot of on medieval manuscripts, for example, and that's a good occasion to understand what was the differences between the care for manuscripts in a very long period. And so the reintroducing the question of the natural history of things is possible only if we add this what we call care, this social history of the care for things. You're really right. And I have to answer the question about Descola and Lévi-Strauss, Vivero de Castro, which is a huge question. About this question, I think that it's important to understand that the Descola's point of view is not really, I think that's my understanding, is not really a postmodernist position in the sense of Latour or Vivero de Castro. And Descola is very Lévi-Straussian and very positivist in a certain way, because he really thinks that the ontologies are a system of interpretation of the world. And even it could seem a little bit hard, and that we can clearly see that there are a lot of problems. And overall, what you said, and I think the biggest problem is the relationship between analogism and naturalism in the history of Western societies. And we clearly see that from the antiquity to the scientific revolution, there are a lot of gray zones and of mixed situation. And even after the scientific revolution, naturalism is more, naturalism has consequences such as science or capitalism in a certain way, but it's overall a narrative. And that is the point to discuss, I think, with Descola, because the question is more the birth of a new narrative. And the risk in Descola's book and proposal is to rebuild another big narrative about this history. So I think you're right, and I think that there is really something to discuss with him as historians.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I was a little bit long.
No, this is fantastic. That's exactly the other you've just introduced the other question, Julia, and Etienne responding the question that we have, which is, yes, we can look at comparison as a way of thinking, but then there is the way of narrating, right? And that's going to be the other question. I want to give the opportunity to the last two hands that were raised well before the end of our time. So I will call on these two. If anyone has to go, please do leave. But Claude Calam is next.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this very stimulating paper. I would have a very broad question, and then I could imagine a very embarrassing one. But I would just ask you, in this interface between, on one hand, the human being, and on the other hand, his environment, what is the role of perception? And thinking of the perception of the sensual perception, of course, perception depending on our body, and this perception varies from an individual to another one, and of course, a more intellectual perception, I would say, perception which is an interpretive one, and an interpretive one which is based on a kind of semiotics, which varies also from one person to the other one, but from one culture and from one period to the other one. And insofar, of course, the concept of nature is the object of an interpretation and of a cultural interpretation. Well, you may have some hints maybe in this direction.
I'm not really a specialist of the question of perception, even in the Middle Ages, in the European Middle Ages. But I think that the question is very important, because perception is one of the best topics to reinterpret the relationship between nature and culture. I mean that there are a lot of people, for example, in cognitive sciences, you say that, cognitive sciences in English? Or
Cognitive science.
Yes, that are working on the question of historical perception as determined by, for example, genetics, or a sort of very long trend of evolutionism. And in the other sense, we know that we have some research on the question of perception as a mix, something related, for example, to the concept of affordance, the capacity, the natural cultural capacity to understand the environment that was built in the same time by the body, and in some case by the unique specificities of one person's body, and another way built by the language. And I think it's important, because I think it's a way to reconstruct the question of universalism that was addressed by Lévi-Strauss, for example, but on new basis, because the question is not anymore the structure of the mind and the relationship between these structures and the language, for example, but the question of the construction of the interface human environment, or human non-human relationship. And I think that for this question that was, for example, I don't know, David Greenberg on artistry made this question very relevant, but it's very difficult for us to find materials to understand how the perception was really shaped in the ancient worlds, as you know. So we go back on this point to the question of narrative, because have we can work with cognitivists and biologists today on this question of perception, but for the past, we have to deal with narratives that construct our perception of past people's perception. But I know you know that there is no answer to this question because I know well your work.
Thank you. And final question, Deborah Sugar.
I think I've got a one-word question. Books. So like not your manuscripts, but the kind of books that are on your shelf. Or, I mean, what I kept thinking of was Panofsky's Gothic Architecture and Scholasticism, those kind of books that, how do they fit in your, I mean, they were once thought of as a central kind of cultural heritage, but it's hard to see how they fit in your model.
But why is it hard to understand why these books can fit with the model? Because there is a materiality in these books too. And for example, I work a lot with the National Library on the problem of the protection of paper, and the most fragile papers are the papers used for the 20th century's books, and my manuscripts are very strong in comparison with these books. So I can imagine that in the next 2 centuries, it will be very complicated to preserve Panofsky's work, more complicated to preserve Panofsky's work than to preserve, for example, Clement VI preaching that I worked on in my PhD. So I know that was not only a joke, because I think that we go back to the question of the heritage as process, and we as actors of this process, and what we are doing now and with the books. But the most interesting is, for example, computers and data, how to preserve and to reuse this sort of things is not completely obvious, I think. But maybe I didn't understand your question. No, tell me.
No, I think that, I mean, the question of preservation is obviously one, but I've got here my my mother's 1937 Milton, which is not quite as good as having a first edition, but it's basically the same thing. And Panofsky will go into a reprint edition, presumably, so that except for the question of preservation, in terms of cultural significance, in other words, the question of meaning and the question of whether history, philosophy, literary history seem to kind of drop out, because the past was understood in terms of its materiality rather than its significance, and as, you know, being held rather than talking to us.
Yes, that's very interesting. But I think we go back to another. I could have delivered my speech about the question of the relationship between material and spiritual in the Western culture. And I think that it's the same type of question, and overall in a very Christian way of thinking in my position of medievalist. Because is there anything as a signification without the materiality of the book, of the painting, of anything else? And I think that for a long time humanities were only concerned with the question of the signification. And I agree with you that we do not have to forget the signification with this material turn, because if we do that at the end, we will forget the half of the problem. But the real problem is not, I think, to choose between both of them, but more to go beyond this dualism. I would like to say. I'm not sure that I'm clear, but you understand what I mean?
The word has to be made flesh before it can dwell among us.
Yeah. Yeah, that's nice. Right.
Well, on that note, we are still virtual though. So I don't know what we do with the Zoom environment, you know, echo artifact, echo fact, artifact. We will probably be thinking for a long time about those things and whether the Zoom has pushed us beyond nature and culture. Thank you everyone for coming along for this talk. Thank you, Etienne. This concludes this session of the ECT. Please join us next Monday. We will have Pierre Sangaravelou with us on questions of comparative history and global history. Thank you.
Thank you very much.